One of the things I notice about Jesus is that he never twists arms. He never tries to get people to do things they don't want to do. In fact, he says, you will know the truth, veritas, that's what that word means, and the truth will set you free. And I've come to believe the converse of that statement. If it doesn't set you free, then it's not truth. And the church I grew up in did not set me free, and I concluded that was not truth. But when I look at Jesus, I'm stunned at the kind of person he is. When I wrote the book, The Jesus I Never Knew, I could go through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you could draw a line. The more respectable, good citizen, obedient, responsible a person was, the more threatened they were by Jesus. And the more of a social outcast, the more ungodly, the more irresponsible a person was, the more attracted they were to Jesus. It's kind of the opposite of what we think. And even the stories that Jesus told, the stories always have the wrong person as the hero. He tells a story about the good Samaritan, not the good Jewish rabbi. He tells the story about the rich man and Lazarus. We don't even know the rich man's name. Jesus doesn't bother to tell us. Lazarus is the hero. He tells the story about the prodigal son. Not the good boy who does everything his father wants, but the guy who squanders it all. And I realized that Jesus came for the losers. Jesus came for the rejects. Jesus came for the social outcasts. Jesus came for me, I concluded. And sometimes when I'm speaking to philosophy students particularly, I say, you certainly have the freedom to reject God, to disbelieve in God, but I am one who believes in God, and one of the things I respect about God is that he gives us that freedom to do that. In fact, I challenge you to find a single argument against God in any of the great agnostics or atheists, Voltaire, Bertrand Russell, David Hume, that is not already included in the Bible. The book of Job, Psalms, Habakkuk, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes. And you can reject God, surely, but I personally have respect for a God that not only allows us to reject him and even to say he doesn't exist, but who gives us the very words we can use in doing that in his sacred scripture. That's not a manipulative, arm-twisting, freedom overruling kind of God. That's a freedom-enhancing, respecting kind of God. Why do I believe, especially coming from a church background like that, why do I believe? Well, I'll be honest with you. One reason I believe is that I haven't found any good alternatives to faith. There's a scene in the Gospels where people are leaving Jesus because he's not an easy person to follow. Don't ever follow Jesus because you think he's going to make your life easier. Jesus makes your life more complicated, much more complicated. You've got to care about things that it's easier not to care about. Jesus doesn't give you that option. To follow me, you have to care about the kind of people I care about, he says. I can't think of any alternatives, really, to religion. Every society ever studied by anthropologists, sociologists, has a defined religious belief. Now, there are some scientists today who have no religious belief. One of my favorite science writers is a man named Chet Ramo. Chet Ramo was involved in InterVarsity, which is one of your Christian programs here on campus in northeastern universities, but eventually forsook his faith. And he writes beautiful books. He writes a column in Boston newspapers, and he's an astronomer. And he once calculated the odds. He's an agnostic now. He once calculated the odds. And he talked about the odds of this planet with these electromagnetic forces that result in the exact proportion of magnetism and gravitation and the binding of molecules and carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. The odds of that happening by chance, which he believes. He is not a believer in God. He calculated at 1 in 10 to the 15th power which he goes on to say is a larger number than all the stars in the universe or all the grains of sand on all the beaches of the world. Well, I quoted that one time. I was at a very distinguished meeting. I was speaking on a panel with, there were three Nobel Prize. You've got some Nobel Prize winners here, don't you? All right. This week even. There were 3 Nobel Prize winners, 2 in physics, 1 in chemistry on the panel. And I quoted this, and I said, is this true? And one of the physicists said, well, let me see that. And I gave him the quote, and he studied it, see, 1 to 10 to the 15, 1 to 10 to the 15. You could see the calculations going on in his head. And, you know, there are 3 kinds of physicists in the world, those who can count and those who can't. And this is obviously one who could count. And he said, 1 to 10 to the 15. Yeah, I would buy those odds. And I thought, well, you can buy those odds. You can think, you can come to the conclusion that everything around us, the reefs offshore, the mountains here where I live in Colorado, all of this just happened. There are people who believe that. But those aren't odds that I accept. Those aren't odds that most people accept. I view the world rather, I see signs. It's not a perfect world, but I see signs of creativity and beauty and genius. When I read books of theology, they always start off with these big words like omniscience and omnipotence, and then they have to explain what these words are. It seems clear to me that if the most obvious thing about God, if you look at this world as one of God's creations, is that God is an artist who loves beauty. I climb mountains in Colorado. You probably don't know this, but Colorado is actually the largest state in the United States. Ironed flat. It's got more ground area. We've got 54 mountains over 14,000 feet and 700 over 13,000 feet and 700 over 12,000 feet. And I've climbed a good number of those mountains. I hope to eventually climb all the 14ers. There are 54. I did 44, number 44 this year, so I'm getting there. The only ones left are really hard ones, though, so I don't know if I'll make them. And my wife would say numerous times this happens. I'll lose the trail. And I'll be hiking along, and suddenly I realize you look for these cairns, little statues of rocks that people put to let you know when you're on the trail. And suddenly I'll realize there are no cairns. We're lost. And about half an hour later, I share that knowledge with my wife. And by then, we're very lost. And I'll turn a corner, and we're above 13,000 feet, and the trees stop at 11,500 feet, and there's nothing but kind of tundra. And I'll turn a corner, and I'll have the feeling, it's probably not true, but I'll feel, I may be the only person who has ever seen this sight in the history of the world, because, you know, by now I'm really lost. And there are a lot of mountains, and they're very large. And what do I see? I see a carpet of wildflowers. Just wildflowers everywhere. They get smaller the higher you get. We call it belly botany because you have to get down on your stomach to see them. And these are flowers that have existed for all of history, even though I may be the first set of eyes, human eyes, that have ever seen them. Or I have snorkeled off the Great Barrier Reef of Australia for centuries. Nobody knew it was there. No one had really seen it close up until Jacques Cousteau invented scuba gear in 1950. And now you go down, and I guarantee you there's no museum anywhere in the world, the Getty Museum, none of them, that has pieces of art more stunning, more beautiful than you see on the Great Barrier Reef, on little fishes that just go around eating each other all day. That's what they do. And I look at this world, I look at this universe, it's lavished with beauty. And I think, that tells me something about God. It tells me something about God. I sometimes tell people that I became a Christian because of 3 things, really. It wasn't the Bible. I was immune to the Bible. I was vaccinated against the Bible in my church. It wasn't a gospel tract. I wouldn't give those the time of day. It wasn't a Billy Graham. I would never listen to him. The three reasons back then, the three reasons that I became a Christian, I say, are the beauties of nature and classical music and romantic love. I thought I had life all figured out, and those things kind of got to me at a soul level. And I remember reading at that time a book by G.K. Chesterton, wonderful writer, wonderful book. And he made this comment. He said, the worst moment for an atheist is when he feels a profound sense of gratitude and has no one to thank. And that's the condition I found myself in, a profound sense of gratitude for this earth, for what I was sensing, what I was feeling, and no one to thank. I gradually, and gradually is the operative word, came to believe that God was not my enemy, that the person the being who invented this universe, created me, was a being who was primarily motivated by love. That the heart of the universe was not a scowl, but a frown, but a smile. Not a frown, but a smile. I came deeply to believe that. And I've increasingly come to believe that a lot of the things that kind of turn people off to religion, they're looking at the wrong way. Part of the reason they're looking at is because the church doesn't do a very good job of explaining it. But I truly believe, if you'd asked me about, say, 30 years ago, what is your definition of sin? I would have said, well, my definition of sin is God's way of keeping us from having fun. And if you ask me now what your definition of sin is, I would say sin is God's way of keeping us from hurting ourselves, destroying ourselves. I wrote 3 books with a surgeon, British surgeon, who is a world specialist in leprosy. And he was head of there was a leprosarium in Louisiana at the time. It's since been closed due to budget cuts. And every year, the top medical people in the United States government would get together for a conference. The head of the Centers for Disease Control, the Public Health Service, that was Dr. Brand, my friend, the National Institutes of Health, the Army Medical Corps, all of them would get together, and they would try to come up with a position paper of what they, as the guardians of the United States health, what they should emphasize. And Dr. Brand told me about this meeting in Scottsdale, Arizona, where all these very high-powered, important, brilliant medical people, these are not preachers, these are not moralists, they're doctors. And all weekend they're talking about, let's try to come up with the 10 greatest health problems facing the United States. If we can agree on that, then maybe we can have a health policy that addresses those problems. Make sense? So they did, and at the end of the time, number 1 was smoking and tobacco-related illnesses, the whole list of those illnesses. Number 2 was diet, obesity-related problems. I think that's now number 1, some people say. Diabetes, all sorts of heart problems related to obesity. Then there was drug addiction, alcohol, fetal alcohol syndrome, drunk driving, things like that. Hypertension caused by stress, sexually transmitted diseases, and finally, at the end of the weekend, they came up with 10 that they all agreed. These are the greatest health problems facing the United States. Violent crime was another one. Now, Dr. Brand had spent 25 years working in India with leprosy patients, and he said, I have been in meetings just like this in India, only in India we'd have a whole different set. Number 1 would be malaria. Leprosy would be up there. There may be 4 million people with leprosy in India. Polio, until recently, was very high. Until recently, there were smallpox, yellow fever, diseases like that. And he said, in India, if I had gone into that group of medical experts and said, you know, I can get rid of your 10 top problems, they would say, oh, this would be so wonderful. Then we would live in paradise. Well, see, we've done that in the United States. There's nobody getting polio in the United States, nobody getting leprosy, malaria, unless you travel overseas. But do we live in paradise? No, we have substituted our own, every one of the 10 top problems that the doctors agreed were things that we do to ourselves. We eat too much. We smoke too much. We drink too much. We have sex with too many and the wrong kind of people. And so I came to see that if God did indeed design this planet and design the human body, he did it in a way for our benefit.